Hi, and welcome to the Woodwind Doubling Guide, Episode 13, Viewer Mail. I've gotten lots of questions, not just on the comments and responses section on YouTube, but also another forum, like the Sax on the Web forum, which I frequent. Been a lot of interesting questions, and I'd like to tackle some of those today, and we'll see if we can do this maybe on a weekly or bi-weekly basis as questions come in. I'm also trying a slightly new rig for this, so I'll be interested to see what the audio and video quality comes out like. But I thought for a Talking Heads episode like this, let's give it a whirl. All right, on to the questions. First question, your comment in episode number 2 about sax racks was helpful. I'd like to hear more about stand choice and setup. Well, I was planning on doing some future episodes just on stands and setups and things like that in the pit. So look for that in a future episode. Thanks for the compliments. Question number 2. It would be nice to see what parts are required in which reed books. Are there sites that list that? Well, as a matter of fact, there is a very useful site. It's run by a gentleman named Brett Pimentel. I believe he has a master's in woodwind doubling, and he's got a beautifully compiled list of just about every show you've ever heard of, and some I've never heard of, and the instruments called for on the original scorings of those or on the rental books. He's kept things very, very well updated, so for some shows you'll see multiple listings of the variants that have come out for those. He'll generally list quite clearly which is the rental book, and that's the one you should expect to see most of the time. Question number 3. I haven't played pit in many years. Any tips for amateur or semi-pro players wanting to get into doubling work would be welcome. For example, a realistic example of a submission or resume would be welcome. Well, getting into professional pit work relies more on kind of an apprenticeship system. You end up subbing for somebody else, or as the English would say, depping for someone else, and you build up a reputation as a reliable sub, and then eventually start, hopefully, getting calls for gigs of your own. That's the way it works in professional settings. In community theater, amateur settings and things like that, sometimes it may just involve you networking with other players or finding out who the music director is for a particular show and saying, hey, I'm available, I can play the books that you are using for this show. So ultimately it comes down to networking, person-to-person contact, getting yourself out there. There are no real submissions or auditions in the field that I work in right now. People get to know you based on reputation. There's nothing like, say, video resume. I know people have done show reels like that. For people looking for cabaret work and things like that, it's a bit more of a thing. And I guess if someone was hiring you, say, for a touring thing and they were cross-country and didn't know you personally, that might be a question. We could probably touch on that in a whole future episode. I was going to do something about video submissions for cruise work. Might be able to roll something into that as well. What about microphones? Are those taboo in pit work? For example, I can play alto flute, but I can't fill a theater without help. In the professional theater these days, microphones are de rigueur. You're going to see everything mic'd. Everybody's mic'd on stage. Everybody's mic'd in the pit or in the loft, or even in remote rooms sometimes. Certainly with things like remote rooms where you're on a video link to the stage, it's always going to be mic'd. Worry about, let the people who do tech worry about that. Nice thing is if you're playing theater where you don't have to have anything mic'd, you can sometimes play something like an alto flute out a little bit. You don't really have to worry about filling the place. That's not kind of that particular instrument's role. I would say let the techs worry about the tech stuff. You worry about playing things as well as possible. We will do something on miking and how to place microphones properly on woodwind instruments in a future episode, because sometimes the people who are miking you up in the pit may know the equipment, but they don't know how to place it on your instrument. So we'll see if you can help out with that. Question number 5. I happen to double on brass as well. Is there any call for that, or is it just a quirk? It's pretty much just a quirk. You might find the occasional piece of on-stage work where they wanted somebody who played all sorts of stuff. It's not going to come up in woodwind doubling books. I have actually on a couple of occasions with Stratford, I've doubled on some odd mixtures of things. I've played guitar on stage as well as electric bass on stage and doubling woodwinds. And I've also played guitar in a pit situation as a double. In that particular case, the orchestrator asked what doubles were available from the orchestra members that they were going to use, and took advantage of all of our various doublings and multi-instrumental capabilities. Rare situation, though. Question number 6. Which saxophones? Is SATB the basic set, or is it just AT or ATB? To clarify, SATB, soprano, alto, tenor, baritone. Is it helpful to have a bass or sopranino? It depends on what books you want to play. There are some books that are going to tend to be more alto. You'll see alto and tenor doubling books. You'll see alto with baritone, tenor with baritone in the same books. Yes, SATB will get you through 95% of what you want to do. The other percentage is really bass saxophone. That crops up in several of the older musicals. Music Man and also West Side Story have bass saxophone. But really don't worry about something like a sopranino. That's a real special purpose soloistic type of instrument. Certainly the only time I've seen soprano on books other than the lead alto book is on the fourth reed book for West Side Story with bass sax and soprano sax on the same book. But generally, alto, tenor, baritone, alto and tenor specifically are going to get you a very long way. Beyond the core grouping of instruments, what extra instruments are really helpful in getting work? Well, I've done a lot of work on things like contrabass clarinet. Again, as a lower woodwind player most of the time, that comes up fairly frequently for me. They're asking also about things like piccolo, bass clarinet, stuff like that. We're going to do a complete piccolo episode soon, and that can come up usually on first and second books, but as we know from some other things, it'll occasionally come up just about anywhere. I've seen shows that have 3 and 4 books with piccolo parts on them. So yeah, if you've got double reeds, that's always helpful part of the mix, and knowing what books those tend to be on, which is usually the 3rd or 4th, can help you be guided a bit in those suggestions. I mentioned Brett Pimentel's site earlier. If you go onto that site and have a look through some of the shows listed, have a look at the combinations on there, and you'll see rapidly what's needed with what kind of books generally. We will touch on some specifics in that, but it's a really helpful guide. How far in advance do you usually get the book for a musical? That can vary quite a bit. I have literally done cold reads where I was called in on an emergency basis and sight read a show on the spot. I've had advanced books that were forwarded, say, about a month ahead. I've had advanced books that were maybe just a week ahead. You pretty much have to be ready for anything. I would say a useful thing in addition to the advanced books is go out and get the original cast recordings or a good cast recording of the show you're working on. Get the music in your head before you get it in front of your eyes. Prepare yourself as much as possible. Do all the homework you can. Next question. How much rehearsing is there before and during a musical? Typically in Stratford, we seem to have about 10 rehearsals or so with the orchestra. That includes usually a sit down with the cast. They call that a sitz probe, where they're just sitting down and singing the music through with us. Occasionally, in terms of dance shows, they'll do what's called a Vondel probe, where they're actually walking around on stage in rough blocking and things like that, and also singing the songs with the orchestra. There's also usually one night called the sound check night, where we'll get into the loft and they'll just sound check individual sections. We'll play things as an orchestra. They'll see how it sounds in the house. So generally about 9 or 10 full-length rehearsals, and that's like a 3.5 to 4 hour rehearsal. As for our rehearsals during the run of a show, we'll often have an understudy run, and sometimes they'll optionally put in an extra touch-up rehearsal for the orchestra themselves. Next question. Do you practice all of your doubles regularly, or are there some that you only practice when you have a gig coming up? I'm probably one of the worst practicers in the world. I always practice when I have something coming up. There are some things I maintain all the way along. I try to stay on the flute as much as I can. If I'm not playing a show, I'll make sure I pick up the flute all the time. That's one, to me, that you really have to make it work. Clarinets and saxophones, I've got such a long history with those. I generally pick it up. If I've got a reed that's good to go, I'm good to go as well. If I haven't been playing larger saxophones in a while, I've been playing small ones all the time. Sometimes it's just a matter of playing enough that I sort of loosen up and relax into those horns so I'm not playing too tight. Do most woodwind doublers own all of the instruments that they double on, or are there places to rent some of the less common instruments? I'm fortunate in that I live in the Toronto area, and being the 3rd largest theatre centre in the world in terms of music theatre, or English-speaking music theatre, we're lucky in that we've got places sometimes that you can rent some of these instruments. I've actually rented English horns and things like that before for recording sessions, before I settled on one of my own. You can occasionally rent some other instruments. It's usually for the oddball stuff that you're going for. Let's say you have a low E flat bass clarinet, but you need a low C bass clarinet for a show. That's the kind of possibility. You may find something in a rental. E flat clarinet, an A clarinet, if those are called for in shows. Alto flute's another one that gets frequently rented. Bass flute, if you're doing some recording work, you may be able to rent. Things that are the core instruments, though, you're not going to see people renting those so much. You may see someone occasionally rent a baritone sax. Easy enough to rent, but again, usually if you're not playing it all the time, you're not getting the calls for it all the time, and if you're having to rent it, you're probably not playing it all the time. So yes, it is possible, but it's more for the oddball things, and not everyone is going to be lucky enough to live in a center large enough to have a business that will rent out instruments like that. All right, thanks very much for joining me on this lovely afternoon for a session of Q&A. Please keep the comments and questions coming. Please leave them down below. You'll also see just below in the show notes links to my favorite products and sites. You'll see a link to Brett Pimentel's site there, so you can go have a look and see what goes with what on his site. Thanks very much for tuning in once again to the Woodwind Doubling channel, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.